Hi, I'm Adam Austin. I'm the cybersecurity lead at a couple of different entities. The entity I'm presenting under here today is called Totem Technologies. We go by our URL, totem.tech, but Totem Technologies is actually an operating unit of Haight Bay and Associates, and we are a U.S. Air Force prime contractor. We're a micro business, a small business, but micro actually. We're 11 employees and an intern right now. And we were lucky enough 5 years ago to write a winning proposal for a small business set aside from the Air Force. And we were recently, 2 weeks ago, awarded the follow-on contract. So we have another 5 year or 1 year with 4 option years. And as long as we perform, we'll be doing that. We'll be executing that contract. So we're here and we thank the Illinois PTAC and the Hispanic Chamber of Commerce for inviting us to present on a very important and relevant topic for all of us, all federal government contractors, and especially those working with the Department of Defense. So I'm here to talk about the current state of the requirements for us as contractors to apply cybersecurity safeguards to our own private IT systems, and also talk about how these requirements are going to evolve and change in the future. So what you must be doing right now and what we must be preparing for in the future. Like I said, I'm Adam. I'm the cybersecurity lead. I've been doing work with cybersecurity work, information assurance work with the Department of Defense for over a decade, 12 years now. And I have a couple of certifications that allow me to work in that field. I have my master's as well. And yeah, so that's enough about me. Let's get into the presentation. Some of you may have seen this example of comparison of jets before, but if you haven't, I'll explain it a little bit. Really, I have these pictures here as a really visceral example of why the federal government and especially the Department of Defense is requiring us as private sector entities, as contractors, to apply cybersecurity safeguards to our own IT systems. So to protect the information that we process. These aren't IT systems that we're selling to the Department of Defense. They're our own networks, our own email systems, our own file servers, our own workstations. How can the DoD do that? The reason they've levied these requirements upon us is because the United States and our allies are actively losing our military competitive advantage through cyber attack and cyber theft. And you see, like I said, a visceral example of that theft here. On the bottom two pictures are of so United States and some of our allies, latest 5th generation multi-role airborne weapons system, the F-35 Lightning II. The prime contractor for this program is Lockheed Martin. At the top, you can see what looks to be just with a cursory look, a very similar looking aircraft. Same wing structure. What's really noticeable is the same forward sweep of the engine intake here. That's a very unusual feature. And this is the Chinese copycat knockoff version of our F-35, what we've designated the J-31. It looks very similar. And all indications are that it performs very similar as well. And that's no coincidence. The Chinese were able to steal much of the information about the design and operation of this machine, as well as information about how to manufacture the components and put together those components that make up this machine. And they stole that information in large part through cyber attack, cyber theft of the defense industrial base, the supply chain, we contractors that work for the DoD. And they didn't just steal secret and top secret, so classified information, the James Bond type information. They stole unclassified, regular old run-of-the-mill information from hundreds of thousands of defense contractors. And in aggregate, the result of that, these little thefts from a whole bunch of us result in them being able to produce a very similarly capable weapons system. And they can do it for an order of magnitude cheaper. So it costs us, the US taxpayers, about $100 million to procure an F-35. The Chinese can produce the J-31 for about $10 million. And the overall F-35 program has cost taxpayers about $1.7 trillion over the span of 3 decades. And the Chinese were able to put together the J-31 in around a decade, maybe a decade and a half. So through that theft, we have lost our military competitive advantage. This is a serious risk to our federal government, especially the DoD. The DoD recognizes that risk and has levied requirements on us, those of us that want to contract with the federal government and the Department of Defense. So I hope you can see this is a visceral example. This is one example of many. It's not just the Chinese doing this to us, it's the Russians, the North Koreans, the Iranians, organized crime syndicates in Eastern Europe and Southeast Asia, all sophisticated actors actively trying to steal information. So we're required as contractors to help the DoD do something about this theft, to apply some cybersecurity practices, best practices to our own internal IT systems. So I'm going to go through provide an overview of the regulations that require us to do certain things. And then we'll talk about how the government can hold us accountable for doing those things. And then I'll show you our approach, so Totem Technologies' approach to helping small businesses meet these requirements and implement the cybersecurity safeguards. So I'm going to start us off with, and my apologies for this, it's a very busy slide. It's an eye chart, but it's also a very good slide. And we can make these slides available to you for download. And each of these slides, or each of these underlined titles on these boxes on the slide, are clickable links. So it'll take you to the actual regulation. But I need to start off with a delineation, a differentiation between a couple of different types of information that we're required to protect as contractors. The first type is Federal Contract Information, FCI. And FCI, the definition almost literally is that FCI is all information related to a federal contract that would not normally be made available to the general public. So this includes, there's a wide swath of types of information that fall under the category FCI. This includes contract information, purchase orders, delivery orders, invoices, all information that's generated by the contractor as part of executing the contract. And this information flows all the way down and all the way up the Department of Defense and federal government supply chain. So there are literally hundreds of thousands, maybe even 1 million federal government contractors that process and store and transmit some type of FCI in their information systems. And by information systems, we mean the hardware, like your laptop, your cell phone, servers, the software that's installed and the applications that are installed on that hardware, the networking devices like firewalls, wireless access points, switches that support the hardware and software, and also the users that use that hardware and software. That's all part of what's called a system. And any of those components in your system that store, process, transmit, what we call handle federal contract information, are subject to some basic cybersecurity safeguard requirements. And these safeguards include the requirement to install antivirus on your workstations and mobile phones. There's also a requirement to secure your physical facilities where you handle FCI. All right. So there are actually 17 basic safeguards that we all federal government contractors have to put in place to protect FCI. Now, if all of the information that we receive or generate as part of a contract is FCI, then a small subset of that information is called CUI, controlled unclassified information. And the CUI, this is the official definition of it down here in the bottom right corner. CUI is information designated by the government through a law or policy or regulation to require some additional protection, okay? And really there's CUI, there's 20 different types of CUI. And the federal government under the Obama administration in 2010 directed the National Archives to develop at least an executive branch wide policy for the protection of this more sensitive subset of FCI called CUI, Controlled Unclassified Information. And NARA, the National Archives and Records Administration, they did that. They developed a organization-wide policy. And then it was up to the individual branches under the executive branch, the individual agencies under the executive branch to adopt that NARA policy. The Department of Justice has its own CUI policy. The Department of Energy has a CUI policy, as does the Department of Defense. And that policy is published in something called the Department of Defense Instruction 5200.48. And this is the DoD policy for handling CUI. The DoD can pass portions of that policy onto its contracting base. And they do that through something called the DFARS, which is the Department of Defense Federal Acquisition Regulation Supplement. Some of you will be familiar with the FAR, Federal Acquisition Regulation, and that's like the contracting Bible that the federal government contractors use to manage contracts. Well, the DFAR supplement is the DoD addendum to the FAR. And there's a clause, DFARS 252-204-7012, we just call it DFAR 7012 for short, that the DoD can put in our contracts and require us to follow portions of the DoD's CUI policy. So remember, this is for the protection of some a little bit more sensitive type of information. It's not classified, so it's not top secret or secret, it's controlled unclassified information. And what the DoD wants us to do with this CUI is add some additional protections above and beyond the basic 17 protections required for FCI. They want us to apply adequate security, more stringent security, and they want us to be able to identify incidents or computer anomalies related to our covered information system and the CUI that resides on it. The adequate security and incident response portion of our responsibilities, so what we're actually responsible for implementing, where the rubber meets the road, in other words, is actually a standard that is developed by the National Institutes, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, under the Department of Commerce. And their standards are published in special publications, and this one happens to be called 800-171. And it's a list of 110 requirements that we as contractors must implement in our information systems to protect CUI. 110 sounds like a lot, and it is. It can be a challenge, especially for a small business. But ultimately, to be in compliance with the DFAR 7012 clause, we have to have three plans. A system security plan, SSP, which is like a set of blueprints for a cybersecurity program for a contractor. A plan of actions and milestones, POAM. So if you think of the analogy of a set of blueprints for building a home, let's say, you have your set of blueprints and you're going to eventually turn that into a tangible home that you can live in, right? But to get there, you have to have a work plan. You have to have folks that understand how to take a set of blueprints and turn that into a house. And that work plan in IT is called a plan of action and milestones, a POAM. And then to abide by this second major requirement here, incident response and reporting, we have to have an incident response plan. And these are plans. These are written documents combined with graphics and pictures and tables. All right. So we can be in compliance with the Department of Defense requirements for protecting CUI by having 3 plans. But that doesn't mean that we have to have all of 800.171, all 110 things implemented yet. We can have a plan to get there. The problem is the Department of Defense has no way of holding us as contractors accountable for full implementation of the standard until they didn't have any way to hold us accountable until last year, where they published 3 new DFARS clauses that can be injected into new contracts only, new RFPs and new RFIs going forward. And one calls out an assessment methodology that we call the DAM, the DoD assessment methodology. And we'll get into a little bit more of this in a bit. And this, at a high level, this requires a self-assessment and also requires us to allow the government in to perform a validation of our self-assessment. But really, this still isn't quite enough accountability to hold us contractors accountable for not letting that information leak out to the Chinese and the Russians. So the DoD needs a little bit more stringent control over us, and to that end, they've published a 3rd clause that can be injected into contracts that would require us to go out as contractors and hire an independent 3rd-party company to perform an assessment of our implementation of the safeguards. And that the model that the assessment model is called the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification. So it will result in an actual certification from a 3rd party of our IT systems. It'll be very similar, but actually a little bit more intense than something like an ISO 9001 certification or an AS 9100 if you're in aerospace, those types of certifications. It'll be similar to that. It'll be a similar process. All right, so that's an overview of the requirements. We're going to dig into a little bit more about the requirements themselves, the assessments, and then I'll talk about our approach to, from a small business perspective, to meeting these requirements. By the way, there has been much talk lately of extending the assessment methodology as well as the CMMC to all other departments under the executive branch, starting with Homeland Security, perhaps the Department of Education, perhaps Department of Energy. So this is not just DoD focused right now. This may very well likely expand to all all federal government contracts. It's just starting with the DoD because the DoD has the most sensitive information right now. So I know that was a fire hose of information. I know it seems like a lot, and there is work to do, but as a small business contractor with the federal government, or if you're planning on becoming a federal government contractor, there's no reason to panic right now, but you do need to get to work. There is some work to do. You have 3 plans to develop, and if the DFARS 7019 clause is in a contract or flowed down to you through subcontract language from a prime contractor, you have a self-assessment to undertake, and we'll talk about the results of that assessment here. So you have 3 plans to build. These are 3 documents, but there's a lot of work to get to this, to be able to develop coherent, logical, comprehensive plans for your organization. And then we'll talk about our approach to doing that, our methodology, at the end of the presentation. So I'm going to skip ahead a couple of slides here to talk about the assessment methodologies. So how the government is going to hold us, or how the DoD right now, and then other departments under the executive branch will hold us accountable. So right now we mentioned that there is an 800.171 assessment methodology, or you can call it the DoD assessment methodology, the DAM. And this, we can be required to follow this methodology if DFARS clause 7019 and 7020 are in an RFP or a contract. And this is really just a a weighted scoring system for determining how fully we have implemented the 110 safeguards that are included in 800-171. And again, or to reiterate, what we're talking about with a safeguard here is something like having to apply antivirus or install antivirus on workstations, or secure our physical facilities with locks and alarms, or develop and implement a security awareness and training program for your employees. Many of you have probably heard of email phishing, where an adversary or an attacker tries to impart a sense of urgency and get you to do something through email, like click on a link or open an attachment or send credentials. Part of an awareness and training program could be training your users on how to spot a phishing email. So there are 110 of those types of safeguards required for controlled unclassified information. And we, as DoD contractors, are required to evaluate our implementation of all of those safeguards. And there's a rubric, essentially, that's part of this methodology. Each of the 110 requirements has a weighted value. And if you don't have a particular requirement implemented at your company, then you actually have to subtract the value from your overall score. They're not all worth 1 point, so you can actually end up with a negative score. And that's very common, actually, especially for those of us that are first starting off on our cybersecurity compliance journey. So at a minimum, Department of Defense contractors are required to self-assess and report that score to the DoD through something called the Supplier Performance Risk System. And we have a blog on how to perform a self-assessment and submit that score. And this provides the DoD with what they call a basic level of confidence of your meeting and fully implementing the safeguards required to protect these certain types of information for the DoD. But as I mentioned before, the DoD itself will on a small subset of us, a few hundred of us contractors a year, they will perform their own assessment to validate our scores. And the wing of the DoD, the branch, the agency, is the Defense Contractor Management Agency that performs these assessments. They can do what's called a medium level assurance assessment, which is an offsite review of our SSP, or they can come on site and inspect us. But the DoD, through DCMA, like I said, they can only conduct a couple of hundred of these a year, and that's not going to suffice to help manage the risk of the entirety of the DoD supply chain, which is hundreds of thousands of contractors. So the DoD, because they realize that DCMA can't do all this work, they're building what they call the CMMC Ecosystem, where we, as contractors, will have to hire out a third-party certified assessor to come and assess our implementation. And if we simply process FCI, so if we just, like the lawn maintenance crew that mows the lawn at the Pentagon, has some sort of federal government contract, right? So they process some kind of FCI, purchase orders, delivery orders, invoices, those sorts of things, the contract itself. They will actually have to be certified at what's called CMMC level 1, and this will include all of us. And as I mentioned before, this is for the protection of FCI, so there are 17 basic safeguards that need to be implemented. I'm going to skip up to level 3. Level 3 CMMC, so those of us that process the controlled unclassified information, which is that more sensitive information than FCI, but not quite classified, secret or top secret. And DoD estimates there are at least 50,000 of us, including Haight Bay and Associates. We'll have to hire an assessor to assess us at level 3. And level 3 in CMMC includes all of the 110 practices in the NIST standard, as well as 20 additional CMMC practices, best practices. So this includes things like in safeguards that we have to implement, like email spam filtering, and email phishing protection, as well as robust antivirus solutions, additional best practices, additional safeguards. There are also level 4 and level 5 of CMMC. A very small subset of federal government or DoD contractors will have to target level 4 or level 5. This will be reserved for the large prime contractors, as well as some of their supply chain members that work on particularly sensitive and high value Department of Defense programs. Now, I have a Department of Defense focus because that's our contract, but as I mentioned before, CMMC, it looks like the rest of the agencies, the rest of the departments under the executive branch are eyeing CMMC as a way to hold their contractors accountable for federal contract information safeguarding, as well as CUI safeguarding. All right. So just because I have a DoD focus doesn't mean if you're pursuing a contract with the Department of Education, it doesn't mean that you can just stick your head in the sand with this. This is probably coming for all of us. And in addition to having to apply and implement cybersecurity safeguards, we're going to have to demonstrate a level of maturity, cybersecurity maturity at our organization. And what this means is that we're going to have to develop as an organization a culture of cybersecurity. Just like, so if any of you are in the construction trade, you have a safety culture that you have to inculcate, that you have to institutionalize at your company. Otherwise, people are going to get hurt, right? And you don't want your folks getting hurt. Neither do you want workman's comp claims. Neither do you want potential lawsuits from injured workers. And so to protect their health and safety, you have a safety culture. Everyone from the top down, from the CIO, the CEO, all the way down to the construction workers, the line workers, inculcate safety. They live and breathe safety. We're going to have the same thing for cybersecurity when CMMC comes along. We're going to have to be able to prove that we have the safeguards implemented, document how they're implemented, and demonstrate that as an organization, we have resources to sustain that implementation over time. Now, for DoD contractors, the CMMC is not quite a thing yet. The DoD assessment methodology is a thing. It is happening. DCMA is assessing a small subset of contractors every year, and we're required to do a self-assessment as well. CMMC won't truly be able to be implemented by the Department of Defense until at least September, so at least the end of this fiscal year. And more likely for the vast majority of contractors, we won't see it for a few years after that. So at Haight Bain Associates, I said we just were awarded a follow-on contract just a couple of weeks ago, and that contract did not have the CMMC requirement in it. And so the earliest that we could possibly have that requirement on this contract, on this program, is another 5 years down the road. Okay, that doesn't mean that we're sticking our head in the sands or kicking the can down the road. There's a lot of work to do, so we're trying to prepare and abide the requirements and prepare for CMMC. So I want to briefly take you through our approach, our methodology that we use ourselves at Haight Bain Associates, and that we also preach and teach to you all, our peers, PTAC clients, Department of Defense, and federal government contractors. And we teach through a series of workshops. We also have one-on-one engagements, and we do outreach like this presentation. So our methodology, our approach to complying with all of these cybersecurity requirements for federal government work is three-phased, or 3 steps. The first step is to determine the scope, determine what's in play, what needs to be protected, what aspects of your information system you need to implement these safeguards for. And the first sub-step of that process is to identify the specific federal government information, especially CUI, but including FCI, that your organization handles. And then you'll characterize how that information flows through your information system, what we call the life cycle. So how do you, let me jump ahead a slide here. How do you receive FCI or CUI? Or do you generate it internally as part of the contract? How do you identify and market? And let me take a second here to describe types of CUI, because FCI is everything related to the contract. In the Department of Defense, CUI are things like engineering drawings for a valve that goes in the engine of that F-35 jet that I showed. The drawing of how to manufacture that valve is considered CUI. At Haight Bay & Associates, we build a user manual for the Air Force, for the system that we repair for the Air Force. We build a user manual. That user manual is considered CUI. All right, so we actually generate CUI internally. We receive some from the government as well. So you want to characterize how you receive or generate this information related to the contract. Characterize how your contract has instructed you to identify and mark that information. So in like a Word document, do you have any instructions to put distribution statements or headers and footers as part of the contract? How do you store it? Internally, externally, in the cloud, at a data center? How and who accesses it? Who in your staff is allowed to access the FCI and CUI? Does it need to be everyone? Can you shrink the number of folks that actually need to access it? Do you have to send out the information externally to subcontractors, vendors, suppliers? Do you need to send it back to the customer? So like that user manual that we build for the Air Force, we actually have to send it back to the Air Force. And then how do you dispose of it? And there are requirements, another NIST standard for how we are required to dispose of federal contract information. But those requirements and standards might have ramifications if you use a shredding service for paper products, or if you print information and you outsource your printer maintenance. So the life cycle of how that information is received, generated, identified and marked, stored, accessed, disseminated, and disposed of. Any of your information system components, and remember components are hardware, software, networking, and the users. Any components that touch any part of this life cycle, that support any part of this life cycle of this information, are in scope. And you'll have to apply these safeguards, these cybersecurity protections, to those in-scope components. For those of you I skipped over a slide, in the DoD realm, from our blog, you can actually download a CUI identification guide for DoD related CUI. And this is actually a PDF, and it will, each of these bold words here have a link to help you work through a decision workflow of determining whether or not you are receiving or generating Department of Defense related CUI, because it's tricky. Remember, our first step is to identify the information. That's often the most challenging step for our clients, to determine exactly what type of information they're processing, because quite frankly, the federal government is not good at telling us what is FCI and what is CUI. So once you've characterized the life cycle, you can start scoping or determining what aspects of your information system are covered or that you need to protect. And then you start cataloging all of your assets, all of the covered components. So hardware and software, you'll capture interconnections of those hardware and software components. So do your desktops and workstations connect to a local file server? Or do you allow your users to connect to something like Office 365 and Microsoft Cloud products? You capture all those interconnections as well so that you can determine how that CUI comes in and may leave your organization. Pictures go a long way. Picture tells 1,000 words, right? So develop system diagrams. Identify the folks at your organization that have security responsibilities, and if your users are handling FCI and CUI, then they have security responsibilities. So you'll need to capture a list of those folks. And you need to prove to the government that no one individual at your organization holds all the keys to the kingdom, that no one individual could abscond with federal government information without anybody else at the organization knowing. This is a tenet of cybersecurity that we call separation of duties. So this can be quite a challenge for a small business where we're wearing multiple hats, right? Like I'm the cybersecurity lead, but I'm also a systems engineer. I also do IT administration in our organization. So it can be a challenge, but if we actually offer templates through our workshops and through our one-on-one engagements that you can help create a matrix that will help identify the duties that should be separated and ensure that they are assigned to separate individuals. Then you can start putting together what we call a system security plan introduction, which is a high level, a 60,000 foot view overview of your corporation, your company, as well as the IT system. And it introduces the actual plans that you start building. So it isn't until this third step in our methodology that we actually start building the plans, the SSP, the POAM, and the incident response plan that help us comply with the DFARS 7012 rule. And then we also execute a security assessment. So recall that one of those DFARS clauses requires us to perform a security assessment. In parallel with our SSP development, we execute a security assessment and develop a security assessment report so that we can report a score to the DoD. So when I said, if I go back a couple of slides, and I'm jumping around a little bit, but compliance means three things, and you don't have to panic right now if you don't have all of the safeguards implemented. You don't have to panic as long as you have these three plans, but there's a lot of work. There's a lot of legwork. In fact, two of our steps are all pre-work that we have to do in order to be able to get to the point where we can actually start building the set of blueprints, the work instructions for turning those blueprints into a cybersecurity program, and the ability to detect anomalies with our cybersecurity program incidents and report those to the DoD. So get to work if you're planning on doing business with the federal government and especially the DoD, but don't panic yet, because the CMMC, which oh, by the way, I didn't mention, the result of a CMMC certification will be, or assessment should hopefully be a certification that allows you to do business with the federal government. And if you don't have that certification, you won't be able to propose on contracts, be part of a contract team, nor execute the contracts, all right? So when CMMC comes, when it's fully integrated into the way the DoD does business, you won't be able to just have the roadmap for full implementation. You will have to have traveled the road. You will have to have fully implemented your plan of action and milestones. But you don't have to have yet. So get to work on these plans, and you will be well on your way towards current compliance with the current requirements, as well as setting yourself up for success, or your organization up for success with CMMC. So that is, I know that's a mouthful, probably seems like a fire hose of information, but that is CMMC and the assessment methodology, as well as the requirements for federal government contracting cybersecurity and the DoD in a nutshell. We have a ebook that we give away for free, actually. If you email us at info@totem.tech with the subject line free ebook, it's several pages. I think it's 30 pages or so that digs into all of these topics a little bit more in depth. but we translate all these concepts into layman's terms. So if you're fresh to this, if this is your first exposure to contractors' cybersecurity requirements, we break it all down and explain it in the ebook. So I encourage you to get your hands on that and read it, and let me know if you have any questions. We're always happy to answer questions. These are ways that you can contact me and our organization. And that's the presentation. Thanks again to Illinois PTAC and the IHCC. And I'm happy to answer questions if there are any. So I'll turn it back over to Angie.
Adam, thank you so much for partnering up with us today and for giving us an overview of this monster that seems to be cybersecurity. That's something that I've been exposed a little bit through the PTAC, but definitely a topic that feels and seems overwhelming at first. So I thank our participants for sharing that time with us today. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A button. If no, you guys have Adam's contact information and mine as well. This is something that if you are planning or if you are thinking of working with the federal government, like Adam said, is something that we need to start working towards, because there are several steps and several requirements, and it's probably not something that we can turn around over time, like overnight. Is requires training and some work to get there. So it is great to start putting these requirements together and start implementing all of those steps. So I don't see any questions, or it seems like, I don't know if Rob is trying to say something.
I can hear you, Angie. I don't know who he's saying.
Yes, yeah, I'm definitely not muted. Ralph, no, I'm not sure if maybe you are having trouble with your audio. But if you have any questions, if this is your first approach, like Adam say, don't get scared. Just get to work, get to learn a little bit more about this topic. And pretty strange, because you can hear me, right?
Yeah, I absolutely can. Yeah.
I'm muted.
And Angie, I will send you the slides so that you can make them available if anybody wants a copy of them.
Thank you so much, Adam. I don't know if anybody has any questions. If no, thank you so much for partnering with the Illinois PTAC at IHCC. And thank you for our audience today for sharing this time with us. And with that, we can just finish. So thank you, everyone, and have a good day.